The officer had his hand on his holster before I even finished turning around. Not drawn, just resting there with the particular studied ease of someone who has done this 100 times and never once been told to stop, and that specific quality of ease, that comfort, was the first thing I read before he said a single word, before I had fully processed the shape of what was happening. I was standing outside First Landmark Bank on the corner of Harmon and 5th 11th of 52 in the morning. October, the air carrying that dry metallic smell that cities get when they're going into winter. I was wearing my best charcoal suit, the one with the French cuffs, silver cufflinks, a white pressed shirt, and beneath that shirt taped flat against my ribs in a configuration I'd gotten very good at over the years, a wire. 13 months of the most careful undercover work the Bureau's Financial Crimes Division had produced in a decade compressed into a device the size of a lighter pressed against my skin. The sidewalk around me was ordinary in the way that sidewalks are ordinary until they suddenly aren't. A woman with a stroller had been moving toward the corner. A man in a delivery uniform was paused over his hand truck outside the sandwich shop 2 doors down. A couple had come out of the dry cleaner next door with paper-wrapped shirts over their arms blinking in the October light. Pigeons. A trash can. A bus pulling away from the stop half a block up exhaling its air brakes. And then the quality of sound on that block shifted the way it does when everyone present understands at once that something is happening and nobody is sure yet what kind of thing. Hey, stop right there. I turned slowly because I learned a long time ago through training, through experience, through the accumulated wisdom of standing in rooms that were trying to kill me, that the worst thing a person can do in an unexpected situation is move fast. Slow movement gives you the half-second you need to read what you're actually walking into. Officer Troy Dunbar was coming toward me from the direction of the parking lot. Mid-40s, white, with a face that had probably been handsome once and had since arranged itself into something flatter and harder, the face of a man who spent years making certain decisions about the world and had stopped questioning them some time ago. His hand was drifting toward his holster with a practiced ease that told me everything I needed to know before he opened his mouth. He was looking at me the way some men look at you when the conclusion arrived before the evidence. And I thought with the particular cold clarity that only comes when everything is about to go wrong at once, about the wire against my ribs, about the code phrase forming in my mind that I hadn't yet sent about Gerald Whitman still inside the building behind me, about the 13 months of careful construction that were balanced right now on the next 30 seconds. Of all the ways this operation could collapse, I had never once considered that a badge would be the thing to do it. Let me go back to where it actually started. Let me tell you who I actually am before I tell you what he did. I grew up on the east side of Cleveland, Ohio, in one of those neighborhoods that doesn't appear in the promotional materials for the city, but is where a significant portion of the city's actual life takes place. Not the worst place in the world. Not the best. Exactly. The kind of neighborhood where your options in life get decided partly by where you're born and partly by how hard you're willing to fight against the decision that geography already made for you, before you were old enough to have an opinion about it. My father, Earl Webb, worked the floor of a steel parts manufacturing plant for 31 years. Foreman by the time he was 38, which in that particular place and time, and with that particular face, was not a small thing. And he wore the achievement the way he wore everything, quietly, without announcement, as if the appropriate response to having done something hard was simply to continue doing hard things. He never missed a day of work in 31 years. Not for illness, not for weather, not for the 2 times the union went on strike, and he walked the line for 6 weeks each time because he believed in the principle and kept showing up anyway. He communicated love through consistency. Through showing up, through being there every morning in the kitchen with the same pot of coffee every evening, at the same table every Sunday, at the same church pew. It took me until I was well into my 30s to understand that this consistency was itself a form of courage, the kind that doesn't announce itself. My mother, Diane Webb, was an ER nurse for 28 years at Cleveland Metropolitan General. She was the person in the room when people were at their most terrified, their most out of control, their most raw, and she had learned over those 28 years that calm is not the absence of feeling. It's the decision to feel it later when the situation has been resolved and you can afford it. She brought that quality home with her. Our house was calm, in a way that I understood only later was a deliberate choice maintained every day against everything outside that was trying to make it otherwise. I'm the second of 3 kids. My older sister Angela is a public school principal in Detroit. Now she runs the kind of school where the test scores are always climbing, and the parents don't want it to leave the parking lot after drop-off, because somebody always has something to tell you. My younger brother Derek did 2 tours with the Army, came home, took a landscaping job for 2 years to decompress, and then opened his own company in Columbus that now has 11 employees and a waiting list. We're not a family that produces people who stop. We were not wealthy. I want to be precise about that because the word comfortable gets used to describe a lot of different situations. And ours was a specific kind. The kind of black middle-class stability that gets built by parents who work twice as hard to hold something that is always at any given moment, 2 or 3 bad decisions away from being taken. My parents owned their house. They paid their bills. There was food on the table and money for school supplies, and not much left over, and nobody talked about not much being left over, because talking about it wouldn't have helped. I was 16 years old, walking home from my after-school job at a hardware store on Euclid Avenue when it happened the first time. I was carrying a bag with a bag of wood screws and a tube of caulk, both of which I had purchased with money from my own wallet. The receipt still in the bag, which, and I want you to understand, that I understood this even at 16 should not have been necessary, but which I had started keeping deliberately as a habit. Because even at 16 I had lived in Cleveland long enough to know that visible and suspicious had a way of meaning the same thing to certain people. The officer who stopped me was not hostile exactly. He was just certain. He had the specific quality of certainty that I would come to recognize over the next 3 decades, the certainty of a man who had already decided what he was looking at and was going through the motions of verification as a formality. He held me on that sidewalk for 22 minutes while he ran my name through dispatch. He found nothing because there was nothing to find. He handed my ID back and told me to have a good evening and drove away. And I stood on the sidewalk with my bag of hardware store purchases and watched his taillights until they were gone. When I told my father about it that evening, he didn't say be angry. He didn't say forget about it. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands around his coffee mug and thought for a long moment, and then he said, "Learn what the system is, Marcus, and then learn it better than anyone who's already in it." That sentence planted something in me that took years to fully understand. Not a desire for revenge, not a desire for approval, but something more specific, a desire to be on the inside of the room where things were actually decided, not standing outside it being told to wait. I was going to understand this country from the inside out, or I was going to die trying, and I was not planning on dying. I graduated from Ohio State with a double major in accounting and criminal justice, which is the kind of academic combination that tells you a lot about what a person is actually planning to do with their life. I applied to the FBI at 24, was accepted at 25, and spent my first 4 years in the white-collar crime unit handling wire fraud cases in the Midwest that were mostly dry and procedurally complex and deeply unglamorous, and which I loved completely because they required the kind of close, careful attention that I was very good at, and that most people found exhausting. The migration to organized financial crime happened when I was 29 on the recommendation of a senior agent who had watched me reconstruct a $4.2 million invoice fraud scheme from a single spreadsheet and 3 months of bank records, and said afterward that I had a particular kind of mind for finding the shape of deception inside large amounts of legitimate-looking data. Which is, it turned out, exactly the kind of mind you need for following money through the labyrinthine structures that sophisticated criminal organizations build to make dirty money look clean. My specific skill. The one that SAC Linda Carver noticed when she was building her undercover financial crimes unit and started looking for people with unusual capabilities was what she described in our first meeting as the ability to become whoever the job needed me to be. Not in a theatrical sense. Not in the sense of putting on an accent or a costume. In the deeper sense of being able to read a room, understand what version of a person it needed to see, and produce that version with enough genuine conviction that the room believed it. She said it the way other people say something that is both a compliment and a warning. She said, "You have a gift for walking into rooms that should cost you everything and walking back out with what you came for." And I understood that she was making me a job offer, and I took it. I had been in the undercover financial crimes unit for 4 years before the Stokes operation. In that time, I had run 2 long-format undercover assignments, an 18-month operation against a textile import fraud ring in Miami, where I was a fabric supplier from Atlanta for a year and a half, and spent more time in warehouses smelling of synthetic fiber than I spent in my own apartment, and a 14-month operation against a real estate laundering scheme in Chicago, where I was a property developer's financial consultant and sat in more glass-walled conference rooms looking at architectural renderings of buildings that were never going to be built than I care to count. Both operations closed successfully. Both required me to be someone I was not for longer than most people spend in a marriage. I want to be honest about what that costs, because I think people who haven't done it have a tendency to romanticize it, and it's not romantic. It's not the muse. It's months of maintaining a second self with enough consistency and precision that the people around you never catch the seam, and the psychological weight of that is real, and it accumulates, and it doesn't fully go away when the operation ends. There are moments in parking garages at midnight and hotel rooms at 3 a.m. and long drives between meetings when you have to remind yourself deliberately and sometimes forcefully which name is real. I was divorced at 38. The job made sustained intimacy very difficult, and my ex-wife, who was a remarkably patient woman, had eventually and reasonably reached the conclusion that she wanted a partner who was actually present, and I had eventually and regrettably conceded that she was right. No children. I am very close to my parents. I call my father every Sunday, not out of obligation, but out of genuine habit, because talking to my father has always been how I find out what I actually think about things. I am not a superhero. I am a professional, a man who has paid the specific price this kind of work requires, and has made his peace with it, or as much peace as you can make with something that takes pieces of you over time. What I knew 13 years in was this: I was very good at what I did. I was very good at it because I understood systems, how they were built, how they were maintained, and most importantly, how they broke. And I had spent my entire career learning to move through both with equal precision. Raymond Stokes was 64 years old, the founder and chief executive of a regional real estate development company called Stokes Meridian Group, which had offices in 3 cities. A portfolio of genuinely legitimate commercial properties that anyone could look up, and a second operation running beneath the legitimate one that had been quietly and methodically processing dirty money through shell entities' offshore accounts, and a carefully selected network of compliant bank employees for the better part of a decade. The Bureau's best estimate was $51 million over 8 years. Conservative estimate. Some of our analysts thought the number was higher. Stokes was not flashy. That was the first thing I learned about him from the files, and it was the thing that made him genuinely difficult to approach. Most high-value financial criminals develop a taste for visible wealth, which gives investigators handles to grab. Stokes drove a sensible car, lived in a large but not ostentatious house in a wealthy suburb, gave money to the same 4 charities every year, in visible but not extravagant amounts. He valued discretion above almost everything else and selected his associates based on careful patient vetting that could take months. He had survived 3 previous law enforcement inquiries, 2 of which had gotten closer than he probably knew. Because his insulation was very good. Because the people between him and anything that could be used against him were numerous and well paid. The Bureau had been building toward Stokes for 3 years. 2 operations before mine had gotten within reach of the inner circle and then collapsed, one when an informant panicked and withdrew one when a chain of evidence was found to be contaminated in a way that would never survive a federal courtroom. When Linda Carver brought me the assignment, she was precise about what she needed: someone who could get inside the network, not through the front door, but through the people adjacent to it, build trust over time, and eventually get close enough to Stokes himself to obtain direct authorization for a financial transaction on tape. My cover identity was Calvin Reeves, a mid-level financial portfolio manager from Charlotte, North Carolina, with a specialty in alternative investment structures and a professional reputation that the Bureau spent 4 months constructing from the ground up. Credit history going back 8 years. A LinkedIn profile with 400 connections. A real office in Charlotte staffed part-time by Bureau support personnel who could answer the phone and respond to emails. 3 references who were themselves agents and who had been briefed and prepared. The identity was constructed with the particular thoroughness that comes from understanding that a single detail out of place can end everything. My entry point was a real estate investment conference in Philadelphia 13 months before that October morning, where I made first contact with Gerald Whitman Stokes's primary financial proxy inside First Landmark Bank. Whitman was 56, compact, precise, with a nervous habit of touching the knot of his tie when he was thinking, and a way of holding himself that spoke of someone who had been living with significant fear for a long time and had adapted to it the way people adapt to chronic pain by incorporating it so thoroughly into their normal functioning that they forgot what it felt like not to have it. Over the following 13 months, as Calvin Reeves Wasif built a relationship with Whitman, of the slow, careful kind that Stokes's circle required lunches in restaurants with white tablecloths, phone calls about market condition, the small, legitimate financial advisory work that was enough to justify the relationship, and not so much that anyone looked too closely. I moved at the pace the network required, not faster because moving faster than the network required was the thing that got people caught. And gradually, by degrees over months, I was drawn closer to the center. 6 weeks before that October morning, I got a dinner with Stokes himself. The real man, not his proxies, not his lawyers, not the buffer layers his organization maintained with such careful architectural precision. The man. We met at a restaurant on the Upper East Side, white tablecloths and a wine list, the thickness of a small paperback novel, and he sat across from me in a private room and looked at me with those pale, methodical eyes and said, toward the end of the dinner, with the particular warmth of a man who saves warmth for moments when he's calculated, it will produce maximum return. Calvin, I think we might have a future together. I smiled back the way a man smiles when he's been offered something he's been working toward for 13 months and not at all like a federal agent who had just been handed the key to the entire operation. That dinner cracked it open. We had enough for indictments already, but Linda wanted one more piece, a direct wire transfer personally authorized by Stokes with a clean documentation trail channeled through Whitman at First Landmark. That piece was scheduled to materialize today in a 45-minute meeting with Whitman at 11 a.m. My wire was live. Danny Reyes was in the surveillance van 2 blocks away, and 13 months of construction was 45 minutes from paying off. I woke at 5:30 to an alarm I didn't really need, because I hadn't been fully asleep since around 4:15, which was typical on operation days, not anxiety exactly, more the particular hyper-alertness that comes when your brain has decided that the current situation warrants continuous monitoring. The Bureau-funded apartment was quiet in the way that tasteful midtown rentals are quiet, the specific silence of a space that has been decorated to suggest comfort without committing to personality. Exactly what Calvin Reeves, successful Charlotte portfolio manager temporarily in the city for business, would rent. I made 2 cups of black coffee and stood at the window in the early dark, watching the city come to life below me, in the specific pieces that a city at 5:45 a.m. assembles itself, from a delivery truck making a stop on the block below, its orange hazard lights blinking in the dark. A man walking a large gray dog that kept stopping at every lamppost to conduct its investigations with unhurried thoroughness. A jogger in a yellow jacket whose breath came out in small white clouds against the cold October air. I watched all of this with the quality of attention that operation days produce in me. Everything slower and sharper at once, the world resolving into its component details with unusual precision. There was a specific stillness that settled into my chest on mornings like this one, something that I had come to know well over 13 years and had learned to trust completely. It was not calm in the sense of the absence of tension. It was more like the feeling of a very finely tuned instrument coming into calibration. Everything present and ready and pointed in the same direction. I dressed slowly. The charcoal suit, the white shirt, the good one, the one with the French cuffs that I reserved for meetings that required a particular quality of impression. The silver cufflinks that had been part of Calvin Reeves's profile from the beginning, because Stokes's circle were people who noticed presentation and who took careful presentation as a signal of the kind of person you were, someone who understood that details mattered, someone who didn't cut corners on the things that communicated who you were. I stood at the bathroom mirror and did the thing I'd done on the morning of every undercover operation for the past 4 years. I put Calvin on the way. An actor finds a character in the last quiet minutes before the curtain rises. Squared my shoulders, let my face settle into that particular register of relaxed professional confidence, breathed out long and even. Then I went to the kitchen table and let Danny Reyes wire me up. Danny had been my field handler for all 13 months of the Stokes operation, which meant he had spent 13 months in surveillance vans and safe rooms monitoring my transmissions and managing the 1,000 small operational variables that could go wrong on any given day. And he was very good at the job, in the way that people are good at things they've been doing long enough to have stopped thinking about them consciously. He arrived at 7:15 with a coffee from the corner bodega, large, black, no sugar, which is how I take it, and the wire kit. And he didn't say much because he never said much on operation mornings, the way you don't talk during the last few minutes of warm-up before something important. We went over the plan the way we always did 45 minutes inside with Whitman. Walk the authorization through, walk out text, the code phrase, drive to the rendezvous hand, 13 months of work to Linda Carver, in a conference room that smelled like dry erase markers and bad coffee. Clean, simple, the way things look when they're 45 minutes from being over. I parked 3 blocks from the bank and walked. The city smelled like autumn and exhaust, and the specific cold metal smell of October, in a place with a lot of concrete. And I kept my pace easy, and even the walk of a man with somewhere specific to be, who was not worried about getting there. Because Calvin Reeves was never worried. Calvin Reeves had been professionally relaxed for 13 months. I passed a police cruiser idling at the corner of Harmon and 5th, noted it with the peripheral cataloging that I do, automatically filed it without concern. Cops parked outside banks on weekday mornings were part of the landscape. I kept moving. I entered First Landmark Bank at 10:58 a.m. and was escorted by a receptionist who knew Calvin Reeves by name to Gerald Whitman's private office on the 2nd floor, which looked out over the lobby through a wall of glass that let him see everything that happened below him, which I had always thought was a revealing design choice for an office occupied by a man conducting Whitman's particular kind of work. Whitman was already at his desk when I arrived, which was unusual. He was normally the kind of man who made a point of being in the middle of something. When you came in a small power move, he performed so automatically, I don't think he was even conscious of it anymore. Today he was simply there, hands folded on the desk, and the quality of his stillness told me that he was working harder than usual to project it. He was 56 compact, with close-cropped salt and pepper hair and the kind of careful grooming that spoke of a man who believed that appearance was a form of argument. The nervous habit of touching the knot of his tie was present today, at a higher frequency than I'd seen before every 2 or 3 minutes. A small adjusting gesture that his hand made before he noticed and stopped it, and the glances at the door every few minutes, a quick check of the lobby below through the glass wall, a scan of the corridor through the interior window. The low-grade chronic fear that he carried had been turned up today, which told me that something in the last 24 hours had made him more cautious than usual. I filed this without letting it show on my face and sat down across from him as Calvin Reeves, who had nothing to be cautious about. The meeting was clinical and precise in the way that Gerald Whitman's meetings always were. He was a man who had learned to conduct his most consequential conversations in the language of routine business, to keep the architecture of what he was doing buried so deeply beneath the surface vocabulary of legitimate finance that even the words themselves sounded clean. He walked me through the transfer structure, the account routing numbers, the authorization language that had been pre-approved by the principal, which was how Whitman referred to Stokes when he was being careful, and the wire was capturing all of it with the crystal clarity that Danny had confirmed in the pre-check that morning. By 11:43, Whitman slid a single document across the desk, one page, formatted like a routine investment authorization memo, which it was technically, except that the account numbers it referenced were the heart of the entire 13-month investigation. He said Calvin Raymond wants this finalized today. Sign where indicated. I read it with the unhurried attention of a man confirming details, rather than the focused attention of a man who had been waiting 13 months for exactly this piece of paper, and I picked up the pen and signed Calvin Reeves's name. By 11:47, I had everything on tape. The wire transfer authorization, Whitman's direct statements connecting the transaction to Stokes, the full routing structure for a $7.2 million movement through the offshore account network. Everything Linda Carver had said we needed to close this, documented in Whitman's own voice in his own office, obtained without a single piece of coercion or fabrication. I shook his hand. Calvin Reeves at his warmest, professional and genuine, and already looking forward to the next meeting. Told him I was very much looking forward to building something lasting with the group. Walked out of the office, down the carpeted stairs, through the marble lobby where the light came through the tall windows in the particular golden way of October mornings, and out through the revolving door into the cold air. The feeling that hit me on the sidewalk was the specific compressed relief that comes at the end of a long operation, the release of a sustained tension you've been maintaining so long you'd almost forgotten it was there, like a breath held for 13 months. Finally beginning to let go. I reached into my jacket for my phone, the code phrase already forming in my mind, the sequence of the next 4 hours running in front of me like a clean road text. Danny walked to the car. Drive to the rendezvous, hand this to Linda. Carver, go back to being Marcus Webb in the morning. I was maybe 30 feet from the bank entrance when I heard it. Hey, you, stop right there. I turned slowly, the way I always turn in situations I haven't been able to anticipate in advance, keeping my hands visible, keeping my movement unhurried, because the worst thing you can do in the first second of an unexpected encounter is create ambiguity about what your hands are doing or where you're trying to go. Officer Troy Dunbar was coming toward me from the direction of the bank's parking lot. Mid-40s, white, the face I described earlier, flatter and harder than it had probably started, the accumulated effect of years of certain kinds of decisions settling into a person's features over time. He was walking with the particular deliberate quality of someone who is not in a hurry, because they have already decided that the situation is in hand, and that the subject, which was what I was before he had said a word, was going to cooperate. His hand was at his side, not on his weapon, but the drift of it toward the holster was already happening, that slow, almost unconscious reaching toward the thing that confirmed his authority. And I catalogued the angle and the pace of that drift, the way I catalog everything in these first seconds, because the angle and the pace of that drift tells you more about what a person has already decided than anything they're about to say. I read him in the half-second before he reached me. This was not curiosity. This was not routine inquiry. This was a man for whom the conclusion had arrived before the evidence, who had looked out from wherever he was standing or sitting in his cruiser, and had seen what I was wearing, and what I looked like, and where I was standing, and had assembled those elements into something specific, and had walked toward me with the intention of confirming it. The sidewalk had already started its freeze. I became aware of it in my peripheral vision. The woman with the stroller slowing, then stopping, entirely repositioning herself to face what was happening, rather than continue in the direction she'd been going. The delivery driver in the uniform, his hand truck balanced against his hip, going still. A couple who'd emerged from the dry cleaner 2 doors down, paper-wrapped shirts over their arms, stopping in place with the particular arrested quality of people who recognized the shape of something they didn't want to be caught in the middle of. And Carol Sims, 58 years old, A heavy-set black woman with a shopping bag in one hand, and the specific expression of a person who has seen this particular kind of thing before and has decided that today she is not going to look away. Her right hand moving to her coat pocket, retrieving her phone, holding it with the practiced steadiness of someone who had thought ahead of time about what she would do if she saw this. "Sir, can I help you?" I said. Calvin Reeves's voice calm opened the tone of someone who is genuinely puzzled rather than defensive. "You were in that bank," Dunbar said. He'd stopped about 6 feet away. His hand was resting on his belt now near the holster, but not on it. "Yes, I had a meeting. Standing around for a long time. This was fabricated. I had been in the bank for 49 minutes, which was the scheduled duration of the meeting, and I had not been visible from the street during any of that time because Whitman's office was on the second floor. But I didn't say this. I said I had a meeting with a financial associate." "Is there a problem? You mind showing me some ID?" In my earpiece, a device engineered to be indistinguishable from a hearing aid. At any distance, farther than 3 feet, Danny Reyes's voice arrived very quiet and very controlled. "Webb, what's your situation? Talk to me." I couldn't respond. I held Dunbar's gaze and reached carefully into my jacket for my wallet, moving with the deliberate visibility that the situation required, and produced Calvin Reeves's bureau-issued Georgia driver's license. Clean, legitimate, as authentic in every detail as any document the state of Georgia had ever produced. Dunbar took it. He looked at it for a long moment, longer than the information on it required, longer than he needed, and then he looked back at me. "You live in Atlanta. In town for work this week. Several meetings. What kind of work?" "Financial consulting. Asset management and investment portfolios." He handed the license back without examining it a second time. There was a brief pause, and then he said, "You carrying a lot of cash?" And that question, the specific phrasing of it, the particular choice of what to follow, the identification with, landed with the cold precision of something I had been recognizing since I was 16 years old, standing on a sidewalk in Cleveland with a hardware store receipt in my bag. The questions sounded procedural. They had the grammar of procedure, the vocabulary of procedure. But they had only one satisfying answer, and that answer was submission, and the thing they were actually about, the thing they had been about since the moment Dunbar got out of his cruiser, was not cash and was not financial consulting, and was not anything on the surface of what was being said. I said I have my wallet, same as anyone. Measured, not defiant. The tone of a man who was answering a question rather than resisting it. The tactical situation had already assembled itself in my mind with the cold clarity that adrenaline produces in trained people. Not panic, but a kind of accelerated inventory. My FBI credentials were in the inside breast pocket of my jacket, 4 inches from my right hand. Producing them would blow Calvin Reeves's cover identity in a public space with approximately 15 witnesses inside of a bank whose second-floor office had a glass wall through which Gerald Whitman could potentially see the sidewalk and potentially within observation range of anyone Stokes had watching the area around First Landmark on a day when a significant financial transaction was being authorized. Producing my phone to text Danny would expose a partially composed operational message on the screen. Refusing to cooperate with a uniformed officer in a public setting created its own escalation trajectory, the kind that could end with me face down on concrete, a wire visible through a pulled collar. With everything I'd built for 13 months collapsing in full view of everyone on the block. There was no clean option. There was only the option that contained the least damage, and even that option required more precision than the situation was allowing. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step over to my vehicle," Dunbar said, gesturing toward a cruiser that I now saw had pulled up to the curb while my back had been turned. "Just for a few minutes." Routine. Am I being detained? Something recalibrated behind his eyes. Not quite surprise, more the expression of a man who had expected a different register of response, who had expected the question to produce compliance rather than a counter-question, and who was now adjusting. "I'm asking you politely." "I understand that," I said. "I'm asking whether I'm being legally detained or whether I'm free to continue with my day." The temperature between us dropped. which is the only way I can describe it. The quality of the air in the 6 feet between us changed, got heavier and more deliberate. He took one step closer, close enough that I could read the small American flag pin on his lapel. With the enamel worn at one edge, could see the coffee stain on his left shirt cuff that he hadn't noticed this morning when he dressed. His voice dropped to something that was only for me. "Don't make this difficult for yourself." Danny sharper in my ear, Marcus. "Please tell me you're not about to get arrested in front of a bank with a wire on your chest." I breathed out through my nose slowly and looked at Dunbar for a long moment and made the only decision that was actually available. The decision that contained the possibility of ending this without blowing the operation or creating a physical confrontation on a public sidewalk. "Officer," I said, and my voice changed, not dramatically, not in any way that the bystanders watching from 15 feet away would have noticed, but in the particular way that happens when you stop being the character you've been wearing and speak in your own register, quiet and precise, the voice of a man who is done translating himself for someone else's comfort. "I need to show you something." I'm going to reach into my inside jacket pocket slowly. "Please don't react until you've seen it." His hand closed around the grip of his holster. Not drawing, but the hand was there now. No longer drifting, committed. "Left hand up," I said, raising it, and with 2 fingers of my right hand reached into my inside breast pocket and produced the credentials case and let it fall open between us. The gold badge caught the October light. My real photograph looked up from the laminated card. Special Agent Marcus Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation. 13 years of service in the specific shape of a gold shield and a laminated card that could be verified against a federal database in under 60 seconds by anyone with access to one. Dunbar went very still. In the silence that followed, I could hear the leaves skittering on the pavement, somewhere behind me, the muted pulse of traffic from the next block, the distant sound of a bus door opening and closing. Danny in my earpiece let out a breath that sounded like a man watching something very dangerous get very close to the edge of something else very dangerous. I said, barely above a murmur, shielding the credentials from the sightlines of the bystanders while keeping them fully visible to Dunbar. "I'm in the middle of an active undercover operation. 13 months of bureau work. If you arrest me or make a scene on this sidewalk right now, you will compromise the cover identity of a federal agent and destroy an investigation into organized financial crime. I need you to step back, return to your vehicle, and treat this as if it never happened. I am asking you professionally." I held his gaze. "Look at the badge number. Run it if you need to. You'll have your answer in 60 seconds. He stared at the badge for a long, airless moment, and then he looked up at me. And what I saw on his face was not what I had hoped to see. There was no embarrassment. There was no professional recalibration, no quick private acknowledgement that he'd made a wrong call and needed to course correct before it got worse. There was no apology of any kind, not even the pre-verbal version of one that crosses a person's face before the words form. What I saw was the particular expression of a man who has been caught doing something and has decided in real time in the space of 2 or 3 seconds that the answer is not to stop, but to double down, because stopping would require him to acknowledge in front of 15 people on an open sidewalk with phones in their hands that he had been wrong. And some men, I had learned this early in my career and never needed to relearn it, will keep pulling at the thread, even after they can see the whole fabric starting to come apart in their hands, because the alternative requires a kind of honesty about themselves that they have not built the capacity for. Dunbar reached for his radio. He pressed the button with the deliberate, studied calm of a man who has already decided how he's going to tell this story and is getting the opening on record before anyone else can. "Dispatch Dunbar badge 3891. Possible 1019 at first landmark on Harmon and 5th. Requesting backup." He released the button and looked at me. The expression on his face had rearranged itself from whatever it had been during the moment with the badge into something that I can only describe as strategy, the specific look of a person who has decided to build a narrative before the existing facts can build one for them. "Sir, I'm gonna need you to wait here." My phone was buzzing in my jacket pocket. "Danny." I could not answer it. I could not move without Dunbar's hand coming off the radio and landing somewhere worse. I stood on the sidewalk, and I did what I had been trained to do in situations that required it, and what I had learned over 13 years to do instinctively in moments where the worst possible response was the emotional one. I waited and I let it happen, and I cataloged everything with the cold mechanical precision of a man who understands that the record is going to be the only thing that matters when this is over. The time, 11:53 a.m. The badge number, 3891. The exact words in the order they were said. The position of the 15 witnesses. The location of Carol Sims still holding her phone at the horizontal angle that meant she was recording rather than calling. The man in the work jacket, a contractor from the look of his clothing, who had also raised his phone, not hiding it, not doing it secretly, doing it the way people do when they've decided that documentation is a civic act. Danny Reyes in the surveillance van 2 blocks away, his voice coming through the earpiece with a controlled urgency that told me he was managing several things at once. I'm calling Carver right now. Do not engage further. Do not say anything else. We are on record. Everything that's happening right now is on record, Marcus. The word record had a specific weight in that moment that I held on to the way you hold on to something solid when the ground is unsteady. The record existed. The record was being created in real time by 3 separate sources. The record was the only thing Dunbar couldn't reach from where he was standing. 2 more cruisers arrived in under 4 minutes. The officers who got out of those 2 cruisers did the thing that trained patrol officers do when they arrive at a situation that's already in progress. They read the scene in the first 2 seconds, not from the narrative they've been given over the radio, but from what's actually in front of them, and what was in front of them was specific enough to read clearly. A black man in a good suit standing with his hands visible holding what appeared to be a federal credential case open. A senior officer who had positioned himself with his hand near his weapon, and a sidewalk of frozen bystanders with phones raised, which in any urban police officer's working experience is not a signal that the person being detained is the problem. The youngest officer. His nameplate read Trask, and he was 26 at most, with the particular quality of a face that hasn't yet entirely settled into the version of itself. It's going to be stepped closer and looked at my credentials case with the attention of someone actually reading it rather than performing a glance. His jaw tightened. He looked at Dunbar. He looked back at the badge. And the expression on his face in that moment was not alarm and was not quite accusation, but was clearly unmistakably something the expression of a young officer who has just understood that the situation he stepped into is different in a very significant way from the situation he was told he was stepping into. "Troy, what have you got?" Trask asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was buying time to think. "Suspicious person," Dunbar said, and his voice had the flatness of a man who has committed to a version of events. "Was casing the bank. Displayed what he says is federal ID. That word says landed in my sternum with a cold, specific weight, because there is no word more precisely calibrated to dismiss the thing it's attached to than that particular word in that particular context. What he says is, not what appears to be, not what claims to be. What he says is as if the credential itself is just my characterization of it, as if the gold shield and the federal photograph and the bureau seal are simply my opinion about what I'm holding." Trask took 2 steps toward me and looked at the badge properly, the way you look at something when you actually want to know what it is. His jaw tightened a second time. "Dale, I'm gonna run this number." "Dunbar. We follow procedure." The flatness in his voice was absolute. The voice of a man who has decided that reality is negotiable and who is currently engaged in the negotiation. In my earpiece, Danny Carver is on the phone. She says, "Do not engage further. Let them complete whatever they're doing. Do not give them anything that goes in their report that you didn't say. We are building this record in real time." I closed the credentials case, put both hands visible at my sides, found a fixed point on the building across the street. A window ledge, a specific brick, and looked at it and breathed with the mechanical evenness of someone who has decided that their body is a tool for the next few minutes. And tools do not panic, and tools do not react, and tools do not give the person who is trying to use them against you the image that would make it easier. But underneath that, something was moving. A slow gathering pressure in my chest building from the place where professional discipline ends and something much older and more fundamental begins. The thing that has no clean name but that black men in America carry from a very early age. The thing my father was trying to name when he told me to learn the system better than anyone already in it. The thing that is not anger, exactly, and is not despair exactly, but is something in the space between them. The specific weight of being looked at and not seen, of having your name on a card and your face in a photograph, and 13 years of service in a gold shield, and having a man look at all of it and choose with the full deliberate agency of a conscious adult to see what he decided he was going to see before he got out of his car. I breathed out long and even, and held the fixed point across the street and waited. Trask made one more attempt. He stepped close to Dunbar, dropped his voice. "Troy, I'm going to run the number before we take this any further." Dunbar not turning to look at him. "We'll sort it at the station." The handcuffs. I know the sound of handcuffs being removed from a duty belt from 13 years of carrying them myself. The particular combination of snap and slide and the faint jingling of the chain link and hearing that sound directed at me produced a very specific sensation that I had not expected and cannot fully describe, something between the abstract and the very physical. The specific strangeness of a tool you have used yourself, becoming the tool being used on you. They were tighter than they needed to be. Not dramatically, not in a way that would show immediately in a photograph, but tight in the way that someone who wants to communicate something about the power differential communicates it, a few notches past necessary enough that I could feel the circulation beginning to be affected in my right hand. I noted this without reacting to it. I noted everything. The door of the cruiser closed with the particular sound it makes from the wrong side, heavier and more final than it sounds when you're the one closing it from outside. The street noise cutting off with a specific abruptness, the world becoming the smell of stale coffee and upholstery cleaner, and the particular claustrophobic quality of air in an enclosed space with no interior handles. Through the window I could see the sidewalk and the people still on it. Carol Sims had not moved. Her phone was still up, still horizontal, her face with the tight, purposeful expression of someone doing something they had decided needed to be done. The contractor in the work jacket was still recording. The woman with the stroller had stepped to one side and was on her phone now, not recording, but talking to someone, her face urgent and intent. I held all of this, the specific details of it, the quality of it, like a hand on a wall in the dark. The record existed. The record was being built right now by people who had chosen, without being asked, to choose clarity over comfort. The record was everything. And then I let myself do the thing I had been holding at a controlled distance since the moment Dunbar's hand drifted toward his holster. I let it be real, fully and completely, and without the protective layer of professional detachment that I use the way other people use a heavy coat in cold weather. I had stood in rooms with genuinely violent men. I had sat across tables from people who moved money through systems that destroyed lives for the arithmetic of profit, who treated human suffering as an externality not worth accounting for. I had spent 13 months being someone I was not in service of putting those people where they belonged. And here on an ordinary sidewalk in October in a charcoal suit with a federal badge in my pocket, and 15 witnesses watching, and a surveillance van recording 2 blocks away, a man with a badge had looked at my name and my photograph and my credentials, and had chosen deliberately, consciously, with the full capacity of a functioning adult to see what he'd decided to see before he ever got out of his car. This was not new. This was not the first time in my life. This was the sidewalk in Cleveland at 16. This was the hardware store receipt in the bag. This was my father's voice across the kitchen table. Learn the system better than anyone already in it. This was what that sentence had been preparing me for all those years, not this specific moment, but the family, It belonged to the long lineage of moments exactly like it, that I had been building myself to survive and document and answer with something more durable than either rage or submission. I let the weight of it be fully present in the back of a cruiser on a Tuesday in October, where nobody could see it. I let it sit in my chest, and I felt it completely. And then, with the deliberate intention of a person who knows the difference between carrying something and being crushed by it, I put it down, filed it, made it part of the record I was building in my own mind, line by line, for what was going to come next. I found my notepad in my inside pocket. I clicked my pen. And I started writing the time, the badge number, the exact words, the exact sequence, every witness I could describe from memory, their positions, their phones, because the record was the only thing that outlasted everything else. It was about 7 minutes before Trask came to the window of the cruiser. 7 minutes that I used to complete my notes and review them, and complete them again the way you do when you want to be certain. He knocked, and Dunbar opened the door from the driver's seat, and Trask leaned in to a distance that kept the conversation private from the remaining bystanders, while keeping him clearly visible on the cameras he knew were watching. His voice had the quality that I have come to recognize as the most specific kind of courage there is not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself, but the quiet kind, the kind that involves doing the right thing in a situation where the wrong thing is clearly easier, and where the people you work alongside every day will notice and remember which one you chose. Troy, he said. I ran the badge number. Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI Financial Crimes Division. 13 years service, active undercover assignment as of this morning. That's what comes back. That's what the federal database says. A pause. I'm putting all of that in my report. The credential check, the result, and the fact that I informed you of the result before you proceeded. All of it. Dunbar was quiet for 3 seconds. 3 full seconds, which is a long time when you're waiting to find out what a person is going to choose. Then anyone can produce paperwork. Trask, the Federal Assignment Database doesn't fabricate active operations, Troy. What you did here today is going in my report exactly as it happened. You detained a federal agent in the middle of an active undercover operation because he was standing outside a bank in a suit after I informed you that his credentials were confirmed. That's what my report is going to say. He paused, and the pause had the weight of a young man who understood what filing that report was going to cost him in the short term and who had decided to do it anyway. I'm opening this door now. Dunbar didn't answer. He was already looking out the windshield, shoulders set with the rigidity of a man who is not retreating, but rerouting. Building even now a different version of what had happened, a version that might survive the report that was about to be filed, a version that might make what he had done look like something other than what it was. Trask opened the rear door. Agent Webb, I apologize for what happened here today. You're free to go. I climbed out and straightened my jacket and looked at Trask for a moment. A young officer, 26, standing in the October light with the particular expression of a man who is ashamed of something he personally did not do, which is its own specific kind of honesty, one of the rarer ones. Officer Trask, I said, everything that happened on this sidewalk today is on record. I know, he said. I know it is. I walked away from the cruiser without looking at Dunbar, turned the corner. And the moment I was out of their sight line, I pulled out my phone and called Linda Carver. She picked up on the first ring. I know, Danny called. Are you safe? I'm safe, I said, and my voice came out steadier than the thing in my chest felt, which was itself a kind of information, the gap between the voice and the feeling that told me I'd been holding more than I realized. The operation may be compromised. Whitman can see the sidewalk from his office. If he watched any of that, Calvin Reeves had a police encounter 30 feet from the bank 40 minutes after the meeting. If anyone from Stokes's network was in the area. I know. Danny is monitoring. Whitman left the bank 12 minutes ago at his normal time, no visible change in pattern. We're assessing. The wire has everything. The transfer authorization, Whitman's direct statements, the full routing structure. If the operation holds, we have what we need. The question is the 48-hour window before the disruption registers. Come in. We'll work it. I need the incident report, full documentation of everything Dunbar filed. I need the bank's exterior surveillance footage requested before end of business today. I need witness contact information. There were at least 2 people recording on the sidewalk, and one of them a woman named Carol Sims. I watched her submit something on her phone while I was still standing there, possibly a complaint already filed. I need a meeting with Dunbar's commanding officer before tonight. There was a pause. The specific quality of silence that Linda Carver produces when she is absorbing something and processing it rather than reacting to it. 23 years in federal law enforcement gives you a very particular kind of patience. You'll have everything you need, Marcus, she said. And there was something in the way she said it, quiet and precise and without any excess weight around it, that landed differently than those words often do when people say them in difficult situations, because it was not a comfort exactly. It was a commitment, and I understood the difference. "Come in," she said. "We're building this right." Danny picked me up at the corner of Harmon and 8th, the surveillance van pulling to the curb with the specific discretion of a vehicle that has spent 13 months not being noticed. He didn't speak for several minutes after I got in, handing me a bottle of water without comment, the way he always understood, without being told when something needed the room to be what it was before the work of processing it could begin. I drank the water without tasting it, and watched the city move past the windows, and reached into my inside pocket for the notepad I'd been writing in during those 7 minutes in the back of the cruiser. I reviewed what I'd written. I added the details I'd observed during the walk to the van. I added the time, the specific words Trask had used, and the description of Carol Sims' face when she held that phone up steady. Because the record was the only thing that outlasted everything else. And I was going to make sure this one was complete. The FBI field office had that specific afternoon quality that I had learned to associate with the end of something institutional. Quiet, the hum of ventilation systems, the smell of printer toner, and the particular variety of burnt coffee that only comes from a pot that has been sitting on its warmer for 3 hours. Linda Carver met me in the corridor outside the 3rd-floor conference room with her tablet already open, and the expression of a woman who had processed her first reaction and moved directly to what needed to happen next. Finch left the bank at 12:08, normal exit, normal route. "No deviation," she said as we walked. "He's not answering his secondary number, which could be caution or could be the beginning of a spook. We have a 48-hour window, maybe less, before he makes a decision about whether yesterday's disruption changes his assessment of the Calvin-Reeves relationship." The evidence assembled on the conference room table and screen was more complete than I had expected in the 4 hours since the sidewalk, which told me that Danny and the Bureau support team had been working the moment the situation started. First, Landmark Bank's exterior camera, a system the bank had upgraded 6 months earlier to high definition, had captured 7 uninterrupted minutes of footage beginning at the moment Dunbar's first call-out reached me and ending when I entered the cruiser. The angle was from above and to the left, which meant it captured both my face and Dunbar's. Clearly my hands throughout, and critically, the moment I opened the credentials case and held it in the space between us. Carol Sims. It turned out had moved with impressive efficiency. She had submitted a formal citizen complaint to the precinct before she even left the block. The complaint had been filed at 12:06 p.m. and had posted her 47-second video to social media at 12:11. By the time I was sitting in the field office conference room, that video had been shared 11,000 times and had been picked up by 2 regional news outlets. A 3rd national outlet had sent an inquiry to the precinct. Officer Ben Trask had submitted a written supplementary statement to his supervising sergeant at 12:34 p.m., less than 40 minutes after he opened the door of Dunbar's cruiser and let me out, before Dunbar had even returned to the precinct. The statement, which Linda read from the screen in a voice that was precisely controlled, documented every exchange in sequence, the credential check. The result. Trask's verbal communication of the result to Dunbar, and Dunbar's decision to proceed with the detention anyway. Danny's surveillance recording covering my entire side of every exchange from the moment Dunbar first called out, including the moment I quietly produced the credentials and explained the operation, was documented, time-stamped and so clear that Linda played the relevant 90 seconds twice without speaking. Then she pulled up Dunbar's official incident report and read from it, her voice carrying the specific flatness of someone reading something. They want to be heard accurately. Officer observed, subject exhibiting nervous behavior repeatedly, checking phone appearing to survey the bank entrance for an extended period consistent with pre-criminal reconnaissance. I looked at her. I was composing a text to my field handler before a meeting with a federal target. My hands were visible at all times on 3 separate recording devices. "I know," she said. She set the tablet down. "His commanding officer is Captain Vera Aldridge. She's expecting us at 4 p.m. The conference room at the 7th Precinct smelled of old carpeting and the particular institutional effort of a space that wants to project neutrality without quite committing to it. The kind of room where difficult conversations are conducted in a setting designed to make them feel procedural rather than personal. Captain Vera Aldridge was in her late 50s with close-cropped silver hair and the measured manner of someone who has spent decades managing the gap between what institutions do and what they should do, and who has learned that the gap is always there and that navigating it requires a very specific kind of care. She sat across from Linda and me with her hands folded on the table and listened to the full account without interrupting, her face giving very little. The way the face of someone very experienced at receiving difficult information gives very little when they want the person giving it to feel they've been heard completely before any response is offered. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nothing you're describing is consistent with procedure." Officer Dunbar did not follow escalation protocol. He did not use standard verification channels before taking action beyond an initial inquiry. And the decision to detain you after Officer Trask communicated the credential verification result is not supported by any protocol I'm aware of. She paused. "I understand the damage to your operation, Agent Webb. I want to. The damage to the operation is one part of this, Captain," I said. "The other part is that an officer with a badge looked at federal credentials and chose to disregard them. That is not a gap in his training. That is not a lapse in judgment under stress. He looked at my badge, he looked at my face, he looked at my name, and he made a decision, a deliberate, conscious decision about which of those things he was willing to let be real and which ones he was going to negotiate away, because they didn't match what he'd already decided when he got out of his car." I held her gaze. I was not performing anger. I was not asking for sympathy. I was doing what I had learned to do over 13 years of sitting in rooms where the truth needed to be stated precisely and without decoration. I need the outcome of whatever process follows this to reflect what is actually documented. Not an approximation of it. Not a diplomatic version of it. What the cameras show, what Trask's report says, and what my account documents, that is what I need the record to say. Aldridge was quiet for a long moment after that. Something shifted in the room between us, not warmth exactly, not the specific warmth of personal connection, but the recognition of one professional by another, the acknowledgement that the person across the table had just said exactly what needed to be said, and that the statement had been heard for what it was. "Internal Affairs will have the full file by end of business today," she said. "The review will be immediate. I want you to know, Agent Webb, that what you've described—" "I know what you want to tell me," I said, not rudely, with the quiet of a person who has heard the architecture of this sentence before, who knows exactly where it goes, and who understands that the intention behind it is genuine, even if the sentence itself has worn thin from use. "I appreciate it. What I need is for the outcome to reflect the record." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, "It will." This is the part I wasn't in the room for. I know what happened partly from the IA investigator's report, which I received as the complainant, and partly from Ben Trask, who told me several weeks later in a conversation that he initiated, called my bureau line and asked if I had time to talk. And when I said yes, he spent 20 minutes telling me exactly what happened in that room with the particular precision of a young officer who had decided that telling it accurately mattered. Dunbar walked into the Internal Affairs Review 3 days after the incident with a version of events that was constructed in Trask's description with the internal consistency of something that had been assembled very carefully over several days. He had been casing the bank. His behavior was consistent with pre-criminal activity. When I produced identification, Dunbar could not verify its authenticity in the field. His decision to detain me was a reasonable response to an ambiguous situation under uncertain conditions. Then the IA investigator put the bank camera footage on the screen. 6 minutes and 47 seconds high definition. Continuous. It showed everything. It showed my hands visible throughout. It showed the moment I opened the credentials case and held it toward Dunbar with the specific positioning of someone trying to show something quietly without creating a public scene. It showed Dunbar's face as he looked at it, the specific expression on his face as he read the badge, the photograph, the bureau seal, the inscription. It showed exactly what happened next. The investigator paused the footage on a single frame and asked Dunbar to describe what he was looking at in that frame. Trask said Dunbar's answer took a long time to come. Then the investigator played Danny's surveillance recording the audio of the exchange. Dunbar's voice, my voice, the exact words in the exact sequence. The moment I said I'm in the middle of an active undercover operation, 13 months of bureau work, and Dunbar responded by reaching for his radio. Then Trask's supplementary statement was read into the record in full by the investigator in Dunbar's presence. The credential check, the result, the communication of the result, the decision that followed. The investigator read it twice. Officer Dunbar, the investigator said in Trask's account, your partner's statement filed at 12:34 p.m. on the day of the incident before you returned to the precinct documents that he verbally communicated the result of the federal credential verification to you before you proceeded with the detention. Your own incident report does not reference that exchange. Can you explain the omission? The silence in that room, Trask said, was complete and specific and lasted a long time. Because there was no explanation. There was no version of an explanation that didn't require acknowledging that he had known and had chosen anyway that the information had reached him, and he had decided it didn't change anything. Because what he had decided when he got out of his car that morning was more real to him than a federal badge, a federal photograph, a federal database, and a 26-year-old partner telling him, clearly, what the verification had returned. He had no answer, and the silence where his answer should have been was itself the record. The IA review completed its findings 6 weeks after the incident. The results were communicated to me in a meeting with Captain Aldridge and a representative from the Bureau's legal team. And I want to be precise about what they were, because precision matters here, and because I have made it a practice not to call things what they aren't. The IA investigation found that Dunbar had failed to follow verification protocol, used detention without adequate probable cause, and this was the finding that came directly from Trask's statement and from the surveillance audio, had knowingly disregarded confirmed federal law enforcement credentials. The finding was formal documented and filed permanently in his service record. When they pulled his full history, which the scope of the investigation had triggered as a matter of standard practice, they found something that landed with the weight of 19 years, 7 prior citizen complaints. 4 of them involving black male subjects who had been stopped in circumstances with no documented probable cause. 3 of those 4 had been settled at the supervisory level, meaning they had been absorbed into the machinery of the precinct's internal process and had never produced a single formal mark on his record. The pattern had been there. It had been visible if you were looking. It had simply never been forced into a document that had to go somewhere permanent. It was permanent now. Dunbar was suspended without pay for 90 days, required to complete mandatory bias retraining. The formal letter of finding was attached to his service record with the specific language that meant he was ineligible for promotion, ineligible for transfer to specialized units, and ineligible for any supervisory role for the foreseeable future. He was not fired. He would go back to the same streets and wear the same badge. I am aware of how to describe what the mathematics of these processes typically produces, And I'm aware that the gap between what happened and what the outcome was is a gap that a lot of people would look at and call insufficient. I looked at it and called it the beginning of something because that's what it actually was. The first time in 19 years that Troy Dunbar's choices had been attached to his name in a way that couldn't be quietly absorbed. A document that would follow him into every personnel decision for the rest of his career, that any supervisor or review board would be required to see, that would exist in every database that pulled his service history, regardless of what he did next. Ben Trask's supplementary report was noted in the review as an example of professional integrity, which was the formal language for what it was: a 26-year-old officer choosing the right thing in a situation where the easier thing had a name and a badge number and a 19-year history that made the choice feel genuinely risky. Trask was quietly transferred to a different unit at his own request, which was both a protection and an acknowledgement of what filing that report had cost him in the informal currency of the precinct he'd been working in. The thread had been pulled. What unraveled from it was not nothing. It was not everything. It was what the record properly built and properly filed could produce, which is incomplete justice and the permanent possibility of more of it. And I have learned over 13 years to understand that this is not the same as no justice at all. The evening of the incident, Linda Carver convened a working session in the conference room that ran until almost 9 p.m. Her Danny Reyes, me, and two attorneys from the Bureau's legal team who had spent the afternoon reviewing the operational implications with the particular focused speed of people who understood that every hour of delay had a cost. The operational assessment was this: Whitman had not fled, had not withdrawn. The authorization memo had not initiated any of the communication patterns in his phone and email records that the Bureau's monitoring flagged as pre-flight behavior. What he had done was send at 3:47 p.m. a single, carefully worded message to Calvin Reeves's number. Calvin, hope there were no complications this morning. Available to continue our conversation at mutual convenience. The studied ambiguity of that message was itself information. It told us that Whitman had seen something or heard something or been told something, and was testing whether Calvin Reeves was still who Calvin Reeves had always been. He was scared, but he was still there. The network values the financial relationship more than it values a specific name, I said when Linda had finished summarizing. Whitman doesn't have direct access to Stokes. If we move in the next 48 hours before whatever Whitman saw this morning has time to calcify into a permanent question, we can introduce a new contact, someone who knew Calvin and is taking over the account relationship. A referral from inside the network, someone Whitman has already met in passing. Calvin had a public incident. Calvin's replacement is clean. Danny. That's aggressive. It's accurate to how the network operates. They move personnel when situations get complicated. We're not introducing something new. We're using a pattern that already exists. Linda looked at the window for a moment, the specific way she looks at things when she's running scenarios rather than looking at anything, and then back at the table. We have 48 hours before Whitman's assessment window closes. We build the identity tonight. All of us tonight. I drove back to the Bureau apartment at 11 p.m. The city was in its late-night register. Quieter, cooler. The streets down to the people who were working the third shift or couldn't sleep or were just moving through the city for reasons that weren't daylight reasons. I sat in the parking structure for a few minutes before going up. Not because I was afraid of what was ahead. Not because the decision I'd made in the conference room felt uncertain. I sat there because I had promised myself in the back of Dunbar's cruiser that I would pick this moment back up when I had the privacy and the time to feel it completely. And I did it now in a parked car in a concrete structure where there was nothing around me but the smell of exhaust and the sound of distant traffic and the particular specific quality of being completely alone. I let the sidewalk be real. The cruiser door closing. Dunbar on his radio building his story. The cold weight of the cuffs a few notches too tight. My phone buzzing in my pocket with Danny's calls I couldn't answer. The 15 people on the sidewalk frozen watching. The weight of being looked at with a federal badge in my hand and still not being believed. I let all of it be fully present, fully real, fully felt, and then with the deliberate intention that I have been building in myself since I was 16 years old, standing on a Cleveland sidewalk with a hardware store receipt in my bag, I set it down, opened the car door, went upstairs, made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and started building the next identity from the ground up: the name, the history, the documentation, the specific details that would make a nervous and cautious man named Gerald Whitman trust what he was being told. The work was familiar and absorbing and required exactly the kind of focus that left no room for anything that wasn't the task. By 2 a.m., I had a foundation. By 4 a.m., I had the outline of a man. By 6 a.m., when the city was beginning to reassemble itself from darkness into the first gray pieces of morning, I had someone new and complete and ready. The new identity was Daniel Cole, introduced to Whitman 3 days later through a mutual contact inside the network who had been cultivated over the previous 8 months for exactly this kind of lateral move, presented as a senior colleague of Calvin Reeves, who was stepping in to manage the account relationship while Calvin dealt with a family situation that had taken him back to Charlotte unexpectedly. The specific detail of the family situation was chosen because Whitman was a man who valued discretion over transparency, and who understood from long experience in the kind of work he did that sometimes people stepped back without full explanation, and that pushing for explanation was not the kind of thing that was done in the circles he moved in. The introduction held. Whitman was cautious, the way he was always cautious, but he was also a man who had spent years doing what he did, and who had learned to assess new contacts quickly and move on, because staying still was its own risk in his world. He met with Daniel Cole once for coffee, 45 minutes, professional and careful, and ending with a handshake and an agreement to talk again the following week. The phone conversations that followed had the quality of someone testing the solidity of something before putting weight on it, and Daniel Cole, like Calvin Reeves before him, held the weight without a visible seam. The wire transfer we had been building toward for 13 months came through on a Thursday morning in February, on a day with low gray clouds and the specific quality of winter light that makes everything look slightly unreal. It was authorized personally by Raymond Stokes in a phone conversation with Whitman that Danny Reyes called in the debrief. 2 weeks later, the cleanest audio capture of 14 years of fieldwork. Stokes's voice, Whitman's voice, the account routing numbers, the authorization language, the full documentation trail that would survive every motion a team of excellent defense attorneys could file. The indictments came down the following Monday. 9 individuals, 2 corporate entities, 1 offshore account structure that had processed $51 million through legitimate-seeming channels over 8 years. Stokes's legal team was good. Genuinely good, the kind of good that costs $900 an hour, and which most criminal enterprises eventually come to rely on too heavily, because no legal team, regardless of quality, can defeat a documentation trail that has been built with the kind of care that 13 months of careful work produces. Stokes took a plea in August. 14 years. Whitman cooperated fully in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his cooperation, the detailed, specific, granular cooperation of a man who had been holding the weight of what he'd been doing for years and was finally, perhaps with something like relief, allowed to put it down, produced 2 additional indictments from a connected network operating through a different set of banks in a different city. I was in my office at the field office the afternoon the plea was entered, alone reviewing files for a separate case that had nothing to do with any of this. I got the confirmation from Linda on my phone, a single text. Stokes entered plea. 14 years. Case closed. I looked at it for a moment, and then I put the phone face down on my desk, and I sat with the specific quality of that silence for a while, and then I sent her back 13 months. Worth everyone. I drove to Cleveland the weekend after the plea was entered. 5 hours south and west through the October countryside, the trees along the highway, doing the thing they do. In the middle of October in Ohio, going gold and amber, and that specific shade of deep red, that you can only find in this particular season, in this particular part of the country. I arrived at my parents' house on the east side at 4 in the afternoon, and my father was sitting on the porch in the October light, with his coffee the way he sometimes does in the late afternoon when the weather allows it, watching the maple at the end of the driveway do what maples do in October. Earl Webb is 72 years old. He is still recognizable as the man who stood in that kitchen 26 years ago and told a 16-year-old boy to learn the system better than anyone already in it. Same broad shoulders, same quality of stillness, same way of being entirely present without announcing it. He had made a pot of the very serious, very strong coffee that he has been drinking exactly the same way for as long as I can remember, and he poured me a cup without asking the way fathers do with things that are simply known, and we sat on the porch together in the October light. He asked me how the case had gone. I told him what I could in the terms available to me, the broad shape of it, the result, the length of the sentence, the number of people the indictments covered. He listened, the way he listens to everything completely without interrupting, adding it to the private ledger he keeps of things that matter and things that happened and what they mean about the world. After a while he said, "That business with the officer, not a question, a recognition. Handled," I said. And then, because it was my father, and because some things don't require translation between people who have been having a version of this conversation for 26 years, the record is filed. His name is attached to it permanently. It goes with him now wherever he goes. My father was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee mug in his hands the way he does when he's thinking through something he's going to say once, and wants to say it right. "Your mother said something when I told her about it," he said. "What did she say?" "She said, 'Good thing Marcus knows who Marcus is.'" He looked at me with those eyes that have been looking at me for 44 years, the eyes that have seen me at 16 with a hardware store receipt in my hand, and at 25 getting on a plane to Quantico, and at every point between and since. "She was right," he said. I drank my coffee, strong and slightly bitter with the specific aftertaste of the brand he has been buying from the same grocery store since before I was born, and it tasted like every early morning. I could remember every kitchen table, every hour. Before the day started, when it was still possible to believe that the work you were doing was enough and that you were exactly the right person to be doing it. The badge was in my inside breast pocket. Same pocket I'd been reaching into for 13 years, same weight, same thickness of the leather credentials case against my hand when I opened it. Not a performance, not a prop. Not the thing that made Dunbar reconsider or not reconsider depending on what kind of man he was. Just the specific, accumulated, documented reality of 13 years of work and the life that preceded it and the name on the card that was always in the end, the only name that had ever mattered. I looked out at the street at the maple dropping its leaves in ones and twos in the still October air, slow and unhurried, and I thought about Carol Sims with her phone held steady at the horizontal angle, not looking away. I thought about Ben Trask filing his report before Dunbar even made it back to the precinct. I thought about Danny Reyes in the surveillance van saying we are on record before anything else because he understood the way some people understand without having to be taught that documentation is its own kind of protection and its own kind of justice. I thought this is what you were carrying through every room, every identity, every hour of keeping your voice level when everything in you wanted to say the actual truth out loud. Not the case, not the indictments. Not 14 years and $51 million, and Stokes's name in the papers, and Whitman's cooperation, and the 2 additional networks it brought down. This porch, this coffee, this October light, this quiet. Mine. Entirely. Unambiguously. Mine. There is a specific kind of courage that never makes the news, and very rarely gets called courage at all. The courage of staying completely calm when someone has decided who you are before you finish turning around and choosing in that moment to let the record speak instead of letting the moment consume you. Marcus Webb did not shout on that sidewalk. He did not perform his anger for 15 witnesses. He cataloged. He documented. He wrote in his notepad in the back of a cruiser while the handcuffs were still on his wrists because he understood something that takes some people a very long time to understand. And some people never do that. Truth properly documented and properly filed has a longer life than the lie that was told to suppress it. The badge number goes in the report. The time goes in the report. The exact words in the exact sequence with the exact witnesses identified by description and position on the sidewalk. The record outlasts everything else. And that record mattered, not because it gave Marcus everything, not because the outcome was perfect, but because it was the first time in 19 years that a specific man's choices were attached to his name in a way that couldn't be absorbed and quietly disappeared. The thread was pulled. What unraveled from it was not nothing. But here's the thing I want you to sit with, because this is the part that belongs to all of us, and not just to Marcus Webb. Most of you watching this have stood on a version of that sidewalk. Maybe not with a federal badge in your pocket. Maybe not with 15 witnesses and a surveillance van around the corner. But in a room, a workplace, a store, a parking lot, a school meeting, a hospital, waiting room somewhere. Someone looked at you and made a decision about what they were seeing before the conversation even started. The question is never whether that has happened. The question is what you did with the record afterward. Whether you let the moment define you, or whether you defined the moment by naming it clearly, documenting it precisely, and refusing to let it be the version of events that stands. The people who made the difference in Marcus's story were not the most powerful people in it. They were Carol Sims, who held her phone steady and didn't look away. Ben Trask, who filed a report he knew was going to cost him something in the short term. Danny Reyes, who said "we are on record" before he said anything else because he understood that documentation is a form of protection that doesn't require a weapon and doesn't require power and doesn't require anything except the decision to tell the truth, completely and in the right place. You are always in someone else's story, one of those people. The one who holds the phone steady, the one who files the report. The one who says "we are on record" when the easier thing would be to look the other way. If this story stayed with you, if some part of it landed in a place that recognized something true, we'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell us about a moment when you chose to let the record speak. Tell us about a time you were Carol Sims or Ben Trask for someone who needed it. And if you believe the way Marcus Webb believes, and the way Earl Webb taught him to believe, that truth properly documented outlasts everything built to suppress it, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, because we'll be here with another story. We'll be here every time.